Hello and welcome back to The Vacant Light. I'm back today with another video review, and I'm covering this album here, which is Exordium's self-titled mini-CD. Now, this is the band's first release, which was originally put out in 2001, from what I know, but it appears that this is actually a repressing. Now, Exordium is currently signed to Northern Heritage Records, which is one of my favorite black metal labels, and they produce music that's aggressive, straightforward, raw, angry, and just enjoyable. Now, in particular, this version of the album is slightly different from the original release. There's two key differences that I've noticed. The first is that they've removed the cover art for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why. And the second is that this album was originally a 4-track release with an ambient introduction just called Exordium, and that was actually rolled into the subsequent track. So this version here is only 3 tracks but contains the same music as the original release. So with that said, let's talk about the music. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Exordium's music is raw, aggressive, and straightforward. And I mentioned them in my previous review of Crushing the Holy Trinity, the third disc, which was called Holy Spirit. In that review, I said that I enjoyed Exordium's music on that release, but I was not too familiar with it, and it was a style of black metal that I really wasn't as much into at the time, comparing it to more mid-paced melodic forms of black metal. Now, this release actually comes before their contributions on Crushing the Holy Trinity, and subsequent to that, they also released a full-length album called In Wrath Principle. I found that on this album, there are some key similarities and distinctions from music that they released on that compilation. Now, in the vocal department, I found that the vocals here are very aggressive, straightforward for the most part, and have a nice mid to high pitch to them. The thing that you'll notice is different from their later work here is that there's almost a kind of croaky, slightly electronic vibe to the sound that comes from the vocals. Now, I'm not sure if that is because there's some electronic effect used, or if that's just the natural sound of the vocalist's voice, but it is slightly different from their later work. And although I do prefer the more traditional style of vocals in their later releases, the vocals here always are very intense, they never let up, and they're really aggressive in your face. And that can really be said for the entirety of this album, really. It doesn't really let up hardly at all. The guitars themselves are quite interesting. What I like to say about this album is that, especially on the first 2 tracks, ignore the intro, what you'll really hear is that the instrumentation really blends together to create one key, one core sound in the tracks, which I think makes them flow quite well. It makes them sound aggressive and sort of fine-tuned to some degree. Now, on the 3rd track, you'll hear a bit of distinction, more of a lead and rhythm kind of guitar distinction there. But of course, it's still quite aggressive, but a little bit more focused on the melodic aspects. The other things I like to say about the guitar is that the sound does not try to be very melodic. Instead, it uses more of a blunt sound, but some of the production values add a little bit of, not quite echo, but a little bit of ambience to that sound to make it really enjoyable and have a little bit of a melodic vibe to it without writing the riffs in a melodic way necessarily. A similar thing could be said for the bass playing. For the most part, it's aggressive, it's blunt, and it fits into both aggressive, straightforward vibes and more groove-oriented sounds. In particular, I found that the 2nd track on this album, called Dark Ending Path, was my favorite song because it really did a good job of adding a nice groove to the music. You found yourself as a listener getting caught up in the groove of that song and just where it really takes you. As opposed to other tracks such as the first song here, which is more straightforward, just raw, aggressive sounding. And the 3rd track on this album is kind of in between those 2 styles. And I feel that the guitar and the bass really work together to create that sort of sound. The bass playing is, for the most part, blunt sounding, aggressive, a little bit thumpy, but not really meant to sound out of place or distinct from the guitar work. Now, there are a couple moments where the bass has a more growly tone to it, but for the most part, it's a pretty blunt sounding vibe you'll get listening to this album. And last but not least, the drumming. The drumming is very aggressive. It doesn't try to be overly technical, and there are times when it is based around more traditional like snare bass kind of sounds. And traditionally I'm not a big fan of those, but I feel that they work very well in the music because the music is quite groove oriented and aggressive, and I feel that that sound fits in well with what the guitars and the bass are doing, which is putting out very straightforward, raw, enjoyable sounds that is not quite catchy, but allows you to get into the real groove of the music. The drums are not overly tight sounding. There's a little bit of resonance to them, and you can hear the cymbal work adding a bit to that. But for the most part, there's not a lot of ambience in terms of the tone coming from the drumming. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to say that this album really does a good job of keeping a consistent tone, but allowing for some subtle differences in the songs. Like I mentioned, the diversity between grooves, aggressive moments, a couple points where the songs get a little bit more mid-paced. And as well, the vocal performance really allows you to hear a few differences in the tracks as well, ranging from mid to high pitch, and some songs having more of that vocal croak than others. So overall, even though this was not something that I really latched onto immediately while listening to, I felt that on subsequent listens, those subtle differences really had me more interested over time, especially listening to this over and over again. Now, comparing this to the work from Crushing the Holy Trinity, the distinctions on that album are more obvious and straightforward, but I found that music that they put out on that record lacks some of the subtleties that I found here, especially because of the fine use of sort of mid-production values with a straightforward sound to create that after-effective ambience in the music. So, all in all, this is an enjoyable release, and do take the time to check it out if you're a fan of aggressive and straightforward black metal. Thanks a lot for watching this, and have a good one. Goodbye.